So my name is Matt. With me is Vamsi. We're from the product management team in SAP Analytics, and we're here to talk to you about developing components with the Design Studio SDK. So this session is primarily going to be aimed at creating custom extensions for Design Studio. So it's going to go into the coding side behind creating those extensions that any designer can then use within Design Studio. And we're going to walk you through the whole process today. As usual, there's a legal disclaimer that we put in most of our slide decks, so feel free to read that later, because these slides will be shared on the SCN site later, and also they're within this Connect as well, so you can grab these later, and the other files that we also mention as well. So in this webinar, first of all, we're going to start off by going over reusing Lumira visualization extensions, because that's something you can do without any coding. Then we'll talk a bit about the Design Studio SDK, position it a little bit, tell you what the important pieces are. We'll go through using Eclipse for developing components. Then everybody's favorite Hello World, we'll show you that. And then we'll show you how to test and debug with Design Studio. And then we'll improve our Hello World extension, and Vamsi is going to walk you through those bits. So we'll end up with a nicer looking Hello World example based on one of the samples that we ship with Design Studio. And just in case you've forgotten in the last couple of minutes, because I know it's early for some of you or late, there's a picture of me, I'm Matt, and there's Vamsi as well. Stood in front of the Golden Gate Bridge, I think. Yeah. Okay, so reusing Lumira visualization extensions. This is something that anybody can do, like designers, developers, anybody. So if you've got a particular Lumira visualization extension that you've already got, in mind, so for example here I'm talking about an extension called the mini area chart that I got from our GitHub page, and we can provide you the links to that later. Once you've got that file, which is a zip file, you can download it, you can install it into Lumira, and then through Design Studio, as a designer, you can actually install it as well. So we've just shown you the high-level steps there. So you can go to the Tools menu, install the extension, and then once you've done that, you use it. It actually gets added, the Lumira extensions, into the regular charts. So you bring in a regular Design Studio chart, you change the chart type to additional chart types, and then you'll be able to find your Lumira extension as well, and then use that like you would with any other component. But this session is about the SDK, so let's actually look a bit more into the SDK itself. So what is the Design Studio SDK? It's something that lets you create SDK extensions. So extensions are components that show up inside Design Studio once you've installed them, and they'll appear in the component palette. So you can see this on the right hand side. At the top, we've grouped like the standard components, so they're kind of bucketed together. So you've got your analytics, your basic, and your container components. And then any SDK extensions that you install go to, depending on what group you've called, will go down below. So you can see we've got here some custom components, and we've also got some SAP UI5 custom components as well. So all these ones at the bottom are custom components that we've installed into Design Studio in this case. So once they're in there, any designer can use them like any other standard component. They can drag them onto the canvas, set some settings, do all that kind of lovely stuff to build their application. So SDK extensions are created using web technologies, which is why at the invite to the webinar we said to get the most out of this session, you need to know JavaScript, HTML and CSS. And if you know jQuery, that will come in very handy as well, because some of the stuff we'll show you uses jQuery just because it's more compact and quicker to write jQuery than it is to write the equivalent JavaScript without jQuery. So a lot of the stuff you'll see will be based on jQuery. And finally, we recommend using Eclipse to develop, and we'll show you why in a minute. Okay, so next bit. So why, again, are we talking about the SDK? Well, no two customers are the same. And Design Studio has powerful design capabilities, but eventually you might reach the limits of what you can do with Design Studio, even though you can do a lot with it. So with extensions, pretty much anything that you could do in a web page will then be possible through an application as an extension. So here are some pictures of some of the samples that we provide for Design Studio. So on the right hand side we've got an application header, there's a KPI tile, which is actually multiple pieces, like there's a header, a footer, a value, a title. There's a progress bar, there's a nice little ratings widget, there's a slider, and finally a color picker. So these are just some of the samples that we provide with the Design Studio SDK that we'll show you how to download later on as well. Okay, so for the SDK, there are 5 main types of files. So when you create an extension, there are 5 main types of file. The first one is called contribution.xml, and that defines the extension and the components that you want to use inside it, and that's how you will then tell Design Studio what your extension is for and what it can do. So each extension has an ID, so it's unique just to you and to your component, and it doesn't clash with anybody else's. Same as if you're developing any extension for Lumira or any other tool. It'll have a title, that's what gets shown to the designer in Design Studio. In our example, that will be Hello World. There'll be an optional icon, you'll give it a version number and a vendor. And you'll also define any properties that you want the designers to be able to see in the property sheet in Design Studio, and any events you want them to be able to do. And so we'll go through on click. So when the user clicks our Hello World, we'll actually send an event to Design Studio saying, hey, there's been an on-click, and then they could actually write some scripts in Design Studio if they want to do something else. And you can also, in this file, say what type of control you're developing. So we're going to use div, which is just the standard type of content on a web page. If you've done HTML, you'll see divs all over the place. We're just going to use div for that, and that's a default one, but you can also do UI5 based components as well if you want to, but that's for a different session. This is just an introduction to the SDK. And finally, you can reference other files that your component needs. So that could be JavaScript files, CSS files, and the additional property sheet for Design Studio as well if you also need that. So moving on to the JavaScript files, they define the behavior and the visual appearance of your extension. They extend from a specific component in the SDK, which is sap.designstudio.sdk.component. So each one of the extensions we show you will be extending from the SDK component. And finally, the div that I just talked about, when you want to access that and modify it, and that's where you'll build your visual appearance, there's this bit of syntax here, which is this.$.open close parentheses. That's how you get access to the div that you need to build your stuff inside of. So you'll see Vamsi referring to that later on as well. That's just how you get a hold of the div, and it returns a jQuery type object that you can use. Okay, CSS files. These are optional, but this is how you define the styles that you want to set up for your component. And these are the styles that you might want to set up that then might not be changeable by the user or the designer, but these are some other styles. So we're going to use a colored box example. You'll see there's a black border inside there. We define that in the CSS file. The next one is the contribution.ztl or ztl, depending on where you're from. And this defines some methods that as a designer you can call on this extension. So we're going to do things like get color, set color, to be able to let the designer change the color at runtime, not just design time in a property sheet. So that's where you define anything that your component can do that a designer could make use of at runtime. And Vamsi will show you that. And finally, there's the additional property sheet. And sometimes what you've got is, we have a load of properties that you've defined. You might want to control the order that they're shown in, or the groupings that they're in, or maybe show or hide some depending on what are the settings the designer's making. You can do all of that weird and wonderful stuff inside the additional property sheet, which is basically, it's a mini web application that has a HTML page to build the UI and a JavaScript file to control getting and setting all those settings. So the high level steps are to add any properties that you want into the contribution file, to add the JavaScript references into there as well, to optionally define these getters and setters that the designer can use, and then test it, debug it, and deploy it. Okay, so using Eclipse for developing components, we're just going to go very quickly through this. So the version of Eclipse we recommend is the Eclipse IDE for Java EE developers, and it's the 64-bit version, which matches the 64-bit version of Design Studio. So you download that, and we've provided the link there and at the end of the webinar. And you download the Design Studio SDK, and we'll show you where you can do that later, and also get the documentation, the developer guide that this is based on. You register the Design Studio SDK XML schema, so then Eclipse knows about settings in your contribution files. Then you import a sample, and then you set the target platform. And the reason we do that is although we're developing in Eclipse, we want to test this in Design Studio. So that tells Eclipse how to launch Design Studio with your extensions inside it as well, so you can then see it, and then you'll test your sample as well, which is where you can debug it. So first of all, what we're going to do is do everybody's favorite example of Hello World, and we're going to base this on the colored box sample that we ship with the Design Studio SDK. And then, so Vamsi's going to start off with that, and then what he'll do is he'll do a better version of this where we actually center the text in the middle of the box, and we also automatically color the text to be black or white depending on the background color of the box, and he'll also add an additional property sheet and a color picker in there. So that's what we're going to do basically during this. And while Vamsi's doing that, I'll be on the chat window, so if you've got any questions, let us know. Over to you, Vamsi.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. So, Matt quickly gave you a very quick overview of the different files and a very quick high-level steps that you have to go through to build a component. So, I'll show everything so that everything is more clear for you. So, first, before we start developing this Hello World component, I want to show you how it looks like inside Design Studio. So, as you can see, we have a colored box. We have the text Hello World inside. This has a property called color that you can change it both from the property sheet here, and we've added a color picker so that the designer can change this color more intuitively. He can pick one from the color picker here using advanced additional property sheet, right? And then this color can also be changed during runtime when the user selects a button using methods defined inside on-click of these buttons. So this is what we are going to build today. So let me quickly run this for you, right? So.
And actually, while you're there, can you just show very quickly how to debug this component, how to find the source code if you do that, while we're already in Google Chrome?
Right. So most of you might be familiar with the Chrome debugger tools, right? So, but since we are really not working with the entire web page, we are trying to debug a component inside our web application. Sometimes it could be tough for you to find where our component resides. So that's under source. Zen/mimes, and then since my component was text colored box, you can see it here, and the JavaScript file component.js is visible here. So this is the code. This is the code for this particular component, and now you can like set your breakpoints. You can run it again, and then click through the debugger, right, between the breakpoints, and then debug it. But let's jump back to Eclipse and then see how we can develop this particular component. Let me close Design Studio now, right. So Eclipse is your development environment, but the way development works here is you would use Eclipse to write code, and then you would, when you run it, your runtime configuration is defined to ensure it opens Design Studio and launches the components inside Design Studio. So there are a few setup steps outlined in the help documentation. Things like setting up a Design Studio as your target. I've done these before, but these steps are also available in the help documentation, right? So once you set Design Studio as your target and set up the runtime configuration, I named it SDK, and then when you select Run, this would open, this would launch Design Studio with these two components that I have here, right? So this was a very quick overview of the setup of your dev environment. Now, let's say you want to start, before you start building a particular component, you would have to create a new project, right? So one way you can start that is you can use our existing colored box example and then rename a few values inside that with the new component that you're building. But to make these steps a little bit easier, what we've done is we've created a utility last week which can speed things up for you. So we'll have this zip file for download so that you can use it later after this webinar. So I've extracted a colored box, but this particular project has a small utility in the extras folder. All you have to do is run the executable. Run the executable and then give it a new name. Let's say you're building a component called scorecard, right? Give that a name and give that a package path, com.sap.sample.
And the name is how it will be shown to the designer inside Design Studio, so they would see a component called scorecard in this case.
Yeah. And then once you do these two things, select enter, and then you're done. One last step is to rename your project itself to scorecard, and then you're set. So this utility would help you skip the manual steps which are outlined in the help documentation, and it will be available for you to download later. But since for this webinar we are building a Hello World component, I have a starter project ready, and which I'm going to import right now into my workspace. So let's go back to Eclipse and then import the project, existing projects into workspace. Right. I'm copying the project into my workspace and then select finish. I've imported the component, our extension code. But as you can see, there's nothing in here. The actual code is missing because we'll be going through through all the individual steps that are required to build out this component. Almost every component, whenever you start building a component, the most important file in our project is the contribution.xml file. It's an XML file that outlines the various parts of your component. The various files that you'll use, like the JavaScript files, the CSS files. If there's an additional property sheet, you would refer to everything here in this particular file and then add code to those files later. So let's start by adding the component.js file.
And it's worth pointing out while he's doing that the reason we're using a file to copy from, just to save you from having to watch us type in every individual character, just to speed it up a little bit.
Yeah. And one quick thing which I want to mention was, this is like developing a component for Design Studio is developing like for any other web framework. What we are trying to show you today is the various files and how you would structure your development, your project itself. So that although you would have you're developing for other web frameworks, you would get a very quick idea of how you can do it for Design Studio. So before I paste that line here, one thing which I wanted to show was the autocomplete feature here. So there's a step in the help documentation which makes you import a schema definition, and if you have that imported, autocomplete would be enabled in contribution.xml, which will show you the various tags that you can use here. For our first step, I am including a component.js file using JS include, right? And I'll copy an empty file into the resource folder. You can, I think I just deleted it. Let's recreate the folder again.
This is live coding, everyone.
And paste it. Yeah. So there we have it. You could really use any folder structure as long as you refer to the files correctly in contribution.xml. So we have a component.js file. It's empty. The first step that you would have to do is add some boilerplate code, and I'll explain what this particular line means. So the way we start off is, like Matt mentioned before, in component.js, before we define our component, we try to extend an existing class that the SDK provides. Right? So we have that.
And can you explain quickly about the naming, the ID of that class? So I can see you're doing com.sap.ds.extensions. Can you explain where that comes from?
All right. So remember, we've defined two things. We gave our component a name and a package path. So this is to identify, sometimes your project itself could have multiple components in the same project. So let's say you are developing 5 different components. You would identify each of them using the package, package path and the name that you gave.
And so that's the same ID that you see in the contribution file for the extension and the component. Is that what you're saying? It's a combination of both things?
And the ID that you have in the component.
Okay, thank you.
So the next step for us is, as you've seen, our component had one property called color. So before we can play with that in our code, we'll have to identify that in our contribution.xml. So we are defining 2 different properties here, one called color and the other called onClick. So color is used to change the color of the colored box, and onClick is used to define any functions that we would add when a user clicks on the component itself. Right? Since we have defined a property called color, it's a good idea to set it to a default value, so that first time a designer drops it onto the canvas, it has a color already. So we can do that inside the initialization, between the initialization tags here, by assigning it a default value. So I think we've defined these things. So let's quickly go back to component.js and add a few lines of code to build out the functionality of the component. Since we've defined a property called color, the first step that you'd want to do as a developer is to modify the color both at design time and at runtime. In this first step, we'll show you how to do it at design time by using this combined setter and getter function. So here, this .color identifies the property, and the function here is used to both set it as well as get the property whenever it changes. So what this piece of code here does, if you are not passing any value to this particular property, that means you'd want to get the existing color property out. So if the value is undefined, it acts as a getter. Like Matt mentioned before, this is used to identify our component on the canvas, and then since our second part here is a jQuery function, we'll be using $ and open close parenthesis to access jQuery, again inside our component, and then a function called CSS to get the current background color of the box. Now, if you'd want to set it, we'd pass the value to the jQuery function CSS. As you've seen here, you could instead of using jQuery, you could write this in JavaScript, but jQuery tends to make things simpler. It's worth investing a little bit of your time to learn jQuery before you start developing components. This piece of line here, all it is trying to do is by returning this object, you can chain other functions to it. One thing which you notice in the JavaScript world when you're developing when you're developing for the web is the ability to just put a dot at the end and then start chaining more functions. So if you want to do that, you would have to return this object so that you can chain functions to your code later. So that was setting color in code. Now we'll go to the actual functionality. So these 4 methods are provided by the SDK itself. So this is to structure your code better so that right set of code is executed at the right time. So if you were to place functions inside init, these would be executed before the component is initialized on the canvas, before update is called, before the setter and getter is called, and after update is called, after the setter and getter method is called. So these are methods to help you put your code in the right place so that they are executed at the right time when the component is being initialized on the loaded onto the canvas. So we'll worry only about the initialization method for our example. So let's delete the rest and then add some code to the init function. So I have a few lines of code that I'll be adding to the init function. Right. So typically, what our component is trying to do, like I said, like Matt mentioned, you've seen that our box has a black border and rounded corners. So this is coming from CSS. So initially, when you if this code wasn't here, the CSS style wouldn't have been loaded. So this is a good place for us to load this particular style for our component. And like I mentioned, there is a way for us to execute other functions when a user clicks on it. So for that, you would need a click handler for the component, and we are using jQuery to attach a click handler for our component. All this is done during init because we typically just have to run this once before the component is initialized onto the canvas. These two lines of code actually mean the same, but I just had this line here to point out the difference. The first one uses jQuery and the second one tries to do it with JavaScript, native JavaScript without using jQuery. We'll stick with jQuery, but just wanted to highlight that jQuery, you could do it by writing plain JavaScript itself. This is commented for now because we still don't have our CSS set up. So let's go back. The first step again is to include the file with the XML tag in the contribution.xml, right? So let's add it here. And then let's create a file called component.css in our res folder. So we have an empty component.css file, and let's add a CSS class to it. So we are calling our class dot hello world colored box. So this is just one style. It's trying to set the border radius, border width, the color, and style, right? So since we've defined the class in component.css, we can go back to our JavaScript file. I'll uncomment this line, and here we can use jQuery to add this class to our function, to our component. So this will attach the CSS class, and we can see a nice black border. I think we have enough to quickly give this a run and to see how our component looks like in Design Studio. But before we jump into and run, I just wanted to highlight, if this component doesn't work for you the very first time, it's probably an error in your title. Because usually when we see a word called title, we tend to get very creative and give a very nice description. You can do that, but when you do it, just make sure you change the bundle name in the manifest file too with the same title. So if you keep these two titles the same, your component would run without an error. So let's give this a run. I am selecting the Run Configuration SDK, which will launch Design Studio with three components: Hello World, Colored Box, and Text Colored Box. So that's Design Studio loading. Then let me create a new app. And then Hello World. Right. So it has these things. I can change the color because we've defined a setter and getter. There is the CSS style loaded perfectly, but it's still missing a few things. One, I won't be able to still change any the color at runtime, and it's missing the additional property sheet. So we'll go back to Eclipse, add these things in, and then run the component again. So the first step to expose functions to modify the component at runtime is to create a file called contribution.ztl. So let's create an empty file called contribution.ztl in the root of our extension project. Right? I have a contribution.ztl file. As you can see, this particular file is, although we said 100% JavaScript, no Java skills required are required to develop a component for Design Studio. Here you would see some Java code, but that is again just boilerplate code that you would have to use once. An empty contribution.ztl file is also good enough, and once an empty file is created with 0 functions, it would still expose functions that are common to almost every component in Design Studio, like set width, set height. But if you want to define custom functions, you would define them inside this file. So two functions that are relevant to our colored box hello world example is the ability to get and set color at runtime. So to do that, I have two functions here. As you can see, this is again a little bit of Java code, but between the two stars here, you can define your you can define the functionality of the method. So I have get color and set color. Now since I placed them in contribution.ztl file, I can use them at runtime. Like I can have a button to change the color to blue, and I can do hello world dot set color blue, and at runtime the component can change its color. So that was contribution.ztl file. And the last thing that we wanted to add was the additional properties sheet. So additional property sheet is not absolutely required. It is if you could always use the key value style of the property sheet, but this is to make the designer's life easier. It's always good for us as developers to provide intuitive components like color picker or a calendar view for the date instead of asking them to type values in. So for our example here, we'll be adding a color picker. So again, before we create any functionality, we'll go back to contribution.xml file, and then we'll refer to the property sheet inside component. So we are adding it in a different place to a key called property sheet path, and then we are defining HTML file here. The reason we are defining a HTML file here is because usually when you for a component already has a canvas for it to render on, which is provided by Design Studio, but additional property sheet path doesn't have a document ready for it to render. So in order to provide that, we create both a HTML file as well as a JavaScript file, and we are referring to the HTML file here. So let's go back and then create these two files. Again, we place them in the RES folder, additional properties sheet, and then it has a HTML file, a JavaScript file, and for providing a color picker, I've used a jQuery plugin called spectrum.js. So these two files are to load color picker in additional properties sheet. I'll be using spectrum.js jQuery plugin. So let's jump into the HTML file first. So this is like any other web page. It has a head section, a script section, and a body section. Since we are referring to additional files, the spectrum.js and a CSS file, let's quickly refer to them in our head section, right? So, and then to load our color picker, we have to attach it to an input form. So let's add a form to our body. So this is not doing anything right now. The actual functionality will be added in the JavaScript part. So this is again similar. Since we are developing a property page, we'll be extending a property page component that is given to us by the SDK. We'll be doing similar things that we did in the component.js. We'll be using an init function and a setter and getter. Again, additional property sheet is just another way to modify the existing property of the component. So we'll be adding setters and getters to the same property color, because essentially we are trying to modify the same property from two different places. So now that we have that, let's add the setter and getter code. Right. One small thing that you would have to think about here is the getter here is used to get the current color value of the property, but the setter here is used to set the value inside the additional of the color picker inside the additional property sheet when it changes outside. So this is specific to this additional properties sheet.
And so it's getting the color value from the actual HTML page. So there's a component, the ID was a color picker or whatever it was. So it's getting the color from the actual HTML page this time.
And then for the main part, which is initializing the color picker itself. So I've taken almost the entire code from their website. So this was an example of how to initialize a color picker from this particular Spectrum jQuery plugins page. But I added a single line. So since we are working, since we have to update the component itself whenever color changes, so we are doing that by using the fire properties changed function here, and we are notifying the page that the property color has been updated. Alright. I think we are almost done. We've added the property sheet. So let's give this a run again. We've saved it. So
maybe stop and share your screen again.
Yeah.
Stop it. That looks better.
So we'll open the application which we've created before. But our Hello World example has a color picker now. Right? So when you change it here, it's using the getter. And this is using the setter part to change it when it changes outside. So that was a quick overview of the example. but we went a step further and we wanted to, like, a hello world example is not complete if we didn't display the text hello world itself. So we made a few more modifications to another project that I'll quickly outline, and then we'll show hello world. So the thing which we did was, one, in order to center the text always irrespective of the current size of the colored box, we created a we created a container and with different cells, and then we are using a table here from CSS, and then we are adding the text to the cell. So this is to center the text, display hello world, center it, and then, like Matt mentioned, a black text on a black background is not readable. So we've used a function here to read the background color whenever the color property is being changed and modify our text color accordingly. So let's give this a run. And we can see hello world in our colored box. So I had a project from before. So this has the text centered, right? And then because we are using a layout in CSS, it automatically gets centered. We have the buttons here. Remember, we've defined a set color function in the contribution.gtl file. So since that is exposed by the component, we have code inside our button here, and then we can set the color of our component at runtime. So let's quickly run this locally, and then the color also changes at runtime. So that was a very quick overview into how the various files that you would have to use to create a component for Design Studio. So Matt?
Yeah, let's just swap quickly back to the slides just to recap that before we open up to questions. Okay, so Vamsi just walked you through the hello world and then went on to the next bit, but the high level steps for that are, so Vamsi walked you through basically setting up the colored box as well, which normally you wouldn't, but we wanted to show you those individual pieces just so you'd be familiar with the files, what you need to add into those files. But normally you can just start from the colored box sample, but then you would rename the settings, or you'd use Vamsi's funky utility, which has actually been uploaded into this connect room. So at the end of this, when the end switches to a different view, you'll see you can download the presentation and the utility as well. Otherwise, you'd have to copy the color box, rename the files and the settings within that to make it unique, and then you add in your references and your contribution file, add your script getters and setters if you want them to be usable by the designer, like Vamsi did, then obviously test it, debug it, and deploy it. And so yeah, we quickly went through debugging this, but we thought we'd include a slide just to show you how. So whether you're using IE 11 or Google Chrome, it's actually similar. So you right-click, as Vamsi did on the canvas, so on the web page, and then you do inspect element, but then after that they're slightly different, so the code is presented slightly differently for both. So for Internet Explorer, you go to that debugger tab, then you click on this little drop-down folder here, and then you can get to your component.js or whatever you'd call that JavaScript file, whereas in Chrome, as Vamsi showed you, you basically expand out the zen/mimes folder, then you'll find an SDK _ include / the name of your component, and then you'll find your JavaScript file in there as well. But for both of those, you can then set breakpoints and debug it.
So there was one thing which we didn't do in the interest of time. So that was actually packaging the component into a zip file so that you can give it to others and deploy it on Design Studio. This is clearly mentioned in the help documentation. So you might want to go over that after you finish developing a component to package it.
Exactly, but what we wanted to show you was how to get started developing these extensions with Design Studio and how those pieces fit together, and then hopefully once you've done that and you've built something funky, you then deploy it for others to use. So that would be the next step, and that's, as Vamsi says, that's covered by the covered by the documentation, the developer guide, and we might show that next time in another webinar. Okay, so then Vamsi went through the better looking hello world, so he did the centered text, he picked black or white depending on the color of the background, and he added the additional property sheet with a color picker, so you can see that there, so that's what he just went through. And so before we open up to questions, if you want more information, so if you're interested in finding more out about Design Studio, you can find it on SCN. If you want to know about the release information for Design Studio 1.5, which is the current release, we've provided a link to that as well, and that also provides other links to some of the documentation and some other useful samples. There's some community samples as well that you'll be able to download. It also gives you a link to the Platform Availability Matrix, or PAM, which tells you what platforms Design Studio is supported on, and some other good stuff as well. And also tells you about some limitations and other bits like that. And then finally, there's the help documentation. So that's where you can go to download both these templates and samples, including colored box that we used, as well as the developer guide, which includes basically all of these steps, including the deployment steps. Finally, that's where you can download the Eclipse for Java EE developers, the 64-bit. So, so we just wanted to provide these links very quickly so that you've got these once you download these slides after the webinar as well. So now we're open for Q&A. So there's a question from Mark about when tips on paying attention when using SAP UI5 in an extension. So there are different types of extensions. We went for the simplest one today, which is a div-based one, so it's just plain HTML and CSS. You can use SAP UI5 as well if you want to as a type of extension, but that's a bit more, it's not an advanced topic necessarily, it's just a different topic to this one. So that would probably be we'd be interested to find out, is that something you'd like to see in a webinar specifically, or because we do have some examples, I think, of that. But basically it's a different type of an extension, so we just wanted to do the one that would more likely match what web developers are doing, which might be using other frameworks than the SAP UI5 stuff. But yes, it's just a different type of extension that you can create that you can use with Design Studio. So some of the samples we ship are actually SAP UI5 extensions themselves. So if you want to, you can have a quick look at those, like the range slider. There's definitely a UI5 one. I think the color picker was as well that I showed at the beginning. Primarily what we've shown you are visual components today, so they wouldn't tend to do server-side scripting, although they could call web services, so they could call out to a server if they needed to, but typically you would want to do that with the data source extension. So that's something we didn't go into today because it's a slightly different way of doing things, but data source extensions are not visual. They're for getting data from somewhere that can then be used within Design Studio. So again, if you're interested in seeing one of those webinars, just let us know, because we can set up a further webinar either around the UI5 stuff or around the data sources. Or I think there's someone on actually there's an excellent blog written by
Yash Modi.
Yeah, Yash, who's actually on here on the call as well at the minute. So he goes into the data source SDK as well, and potentially we might see if he's open to doing a webinar as well in the future in this series. He's also already done an excellent blog. But yes, we can, and I think, I don't think we have any specific examples of that one in the samples that we ship, just because you'd need to set up a back end as well. But it's definitely possible, and it's something we could show in the future. The way we primarily do that with Design Studio through databases is so Design Studio connects to 3 types of data source. One of them is HANA, one of them is BW, and the other one is the Business Objects Universes. Primarily, we'd probably go to databases through universes for Design Studio. But, I mean, you could call web services fairly easy. So we could, what we can do is we can set up a follow-up to this to find out what kind of webinar you're interested in. Because we probably wouldn't do one that accesses a database, because we do that through universes instead. But we would rather focus on, maybe there's a common web service or something that people want to hit or something like that. It could be data source or something else potentially.